In the damp hush of spring 1842, when Alabama's dirt paths turned to mud and the dogwoods bloomed like secrets, twin boys were born in a backwoods cabin, so deep in the trees it never earned a place on any map. The midwife later swore she felt no heartbeat, no breath, no flicker of life, but by the time the storm broke and smoke curled again from the chimney, both boys lay breathing slow and steady, as if they'd simply paused between worlds. Their mother, a young widow named Susanna Fletch, refused to name them, claiming the storm had borne them into flesh, not her. In the weeks that followed, no visitor was welcomed, no gift accepted. When Susanna did appear at the well or in the fog near the pines, she cradled the twins tightly, their faces hidden against her skin, eyes shut like they were still waiting to wake. When pressed by the town pastor, she offered nothing but a far-off stare and a single unsettling truth. They never cried, she whispered. They only watched. It was the schoolteacher, Jonas Kell, who first sensed something off. He arrived with books, expecting children. What he found were two silent figures, seated on stone, motionless but alert. They looked up as one heads, tilting in perfect sync. The air grew heavy. Jonas opened his mouth, but no sound came. He backed away, unsure if he'd seen boys or something older wearing their shape. Years later, Jonas would still swear that something in that room had weight like the walls themselves were listening, the air thick with invisible breath. He left the book behind on a crooked stool by the door, avoiding their glassy, watching eyes. That night, he dreamed of two cradles rocking gently deep in the woods, though no wind moved the trees. When he awoke, a single small handprint was pressed against the inside of his window, pain-perfect, childlike, and deep enough to spiderweb the glass. He never went back. By summer's peak, rumors grew like wild vines. Women doing laundry near the river whispered that the twins weren't two boys at all, but one strange soul divided, always together, always still. One swore she saw them behind the house for a full hour, standing silently, arms tucked behind their backs, facing the woods as if waiting. Another claimed she heard voices rise from her walls at night, childlike and soft, chanting words that didn't belong to any known tongue. When she leaned closer, the syllables melted into the sound of water trickling somewhere just out of reach. Even the pastor's wife, who never believed in gossip, admitted to a sharp, cold pressure in her chest each time she passed that fence line. She said the ache grew worse whenever she remembered no one had actually seen the boys born. Only that one morning the smoke had returned, and the widow's curtain fluttered open like nothing had ever changed. No one ever found the courage to ask why Susanna never named her sons. Over time, the missing names felt like something ancient, older than sorrow, older than death itself. When an early frost hardened the creek into glass and turned the fields ghost pale, Susanna began hanging long white cloths across the porch rail every dawn. They weren't garments, just pale sheets that swayed gently even on windless mornings. Behind them, the twins would stand like cut-out shadows, their stillness too sharp, too deliberate to pass for children's play. Travelers and neighbors alike started crossing the road to avoid passing the house, eyes averted, feet moving faster. One day, a traveling peddler named Willard Pike, unaware of the warnings, arrived to sell thread and soap. He knocked twice, silent, but as he turned away, a soft hum faint and thread-like, rose from behind the linens. Curious, he leaned in and saw them, the twins, their faces blank, lips moving in unison, though no sound came. When he tried to step back, his legs betrayed him. Dropping his satchel, he fled down the path without looking back. Later, when others gathered his abandoned wares, they found every bar of soap etched with a single word, so small and fine it was only legible by candlelight: return. As autumn deepened, the hills grew quiet, under a silence that felt place-settled, like a heavy blanket no human hand had laid. Even the mill wheel paused before winter took its first breath. The dogs stopped barking at the deer that wandered too close, their instincts dulled as if something unseen pressed against their will. Even the creek, once full of sound, flowed in silence beneath a skin of frost. One evening, as the sun faded behind the hills, Susanna was seen walking toward the chapel, a boy holding each of her hands. Witnesses swore the twins hadn't changed since spring. Same pale blonde hair, same delicate wrists, same unblinking, inquisitive gaze. They didn't flinch when the chapel bell rang, nor when the preacher stepped forward to greet them. Susanna paused just shy of the steps, her face worn thin by something heavier than time. "I've come for baptism," she rasped, her voice cracking with disuse. The preacher, visibly relieved, reached for the basin and began to pour the holy water. But before a drop could fall, the twins turned to one another. They held their gaze in silence, then slowly began to smile wide, patient, and unnatural, until their two white teeth gleamed beneath the candlelight. The water darkened in the font, turning the color of ash. The preacher froze, then gently set the urn aside and said nothing more. After that night, no one saw Susanna again. The cabin stood quiet, chimney lifeless, linens on the porch fading to the color of bone. Yet the twins were spotted more often, wandering the yard at sunrise, or watching from the edge of the woods at dusk, as if waiting for something only they could name. A farmer riding home just after dusk swore he saw the twins crouched beside their root cellar, arms buried deep into frozen soil that should have been hard as stone. He called out without thinking, but the boys didn't turn. Instead, they began to hum a slow, pulsing sound that vibrated in the air and lifted the hair on his skin like breath on bare flesh. He didn't stay to see what they were digging for. The next morning, he found a bundle wrapped in rough muslin on his porch. Inside was a fistful of damp earth and a tiny baby tooth, the root still wet and pink. He tossed it into the fire without a word, but it came back, first on his mantle, then tucked beneath his bedsheets, and finally in the pocket of his church coat. No matter how many times he burned it, the tooth always returned. When the first thick snow blanketed the valley and buried the last corn stalks, folks in town stopped wondering where the twins had come from. They started asking what price had been paid to bring them here. The preacher called for a meeting at the chapel to speak openly about the boys, but when he arrived, the pews were already full. The congregation sat silent, wide-eyed. Of them remembered walking in. Then the bell rang out, loud and solemn, even though the rope hadn't been touched in weeks. Outside, the twins stood on the chapel steps, staring up at the steeple, their mouths moving in rhythm with the tolling, as if they'd been waiting for it all along. The preacher's wife swore she saw something shift beneath the boy's skin. that night like something breathing inside them that didn't belong. When the final chime of the bell faded, every lantern went dark at once. In the silence that followed, a single word seemed to echo through the chapel, though no one could agree on what they heard. Some claimed it was ode, others return. But the old widow, who had buried 3 children and never lied in her life, insisted it wasn't a word at all, just a sound, wet and slow, like a cradle creaking with something left too long alone. By the end of the year, the ridge froze solid, and the twins' cabin stood silent beneath a thick crust of snow that refused to melt. The chimney stayed cold. No footprints ever marred the drifts. Still, every dawn, neighbors caught sight of the boys standing behind the frostbitten window, foreheads pressed against the glass, eyes wide and never blinking. One bitter morning, a traveling priest heading to Montgomery left a bundle of candles at their gate, saying no child should suffer December in darkness. He never made it beyond the first mile. His horse returned alone, reins cut clean through, a smear the size of a child's hand darkening the saddle's edge. When searchers arrived, there was no trace of the man, only the candles arranged in a flawless circle before the door, each one lit. No match had been used. The flames didn't flicker, even as the wind howled and snow poured from the sky in heavy, blinding sheets. 4 days after, those who passed the cabin swore they heard 2 voices humming behind the door, low and steady, with the calm rhythm of something not calling out but waiting to be answered. In January of 1843, when the snow finally began to melt from the ridge, a circuit judge rode through to survey the land, drawn not by stories of children, but by talk of unclaimed acreage, untaxed and promising if cleared. His ledger made no room for boys born off the books, nor did it consider what might rise when the frost let go of its grip. He knocked 3 times on the cabin door, his gloved fist sounding dull against the rotting wood. There was no answer, but as he turned to go, he noticed a faint chalk marking at the threshold 2 circles intersecting slightly, like twin eyes open just enough to watch. He crouched to look closer, and the cold seemed to thicken in his chest. The door creaked, open just a sliver. No one stood there, no voice spoke. Only a perfect hush filled the clearing, so absolute it seemed to swallow the sound of his own heartbeat. He backed away and left. When he reached the nearest village, he opened his ledger to record his visit and found every page blank, save for one. On the line where he'd marked the parcel unclaimed, a single word had appeared, scrawled in a trembling hand, taken that same month. A widow named Alma Bree said she saw the twins standing in the sycamore grove behind her cornfield just before sunrise, ankles deep in melting snow, each holding one end of a knotted cord between their small, pale hands. She opened her mouth to scold them for wandering so far from home in that bitter cold, but the words caught in her throat like ice. The twins didn't glance her way. Instead, they lifted the cord in their hands and began to stretch it between the sycamores, measuring something invisible to anyone but themselves. When the final knot aligned with a twisted branch overhead, she saw it clearly for the first time. It wasn't rope. It shimmered in the gray light, thin and translucent, glinting with what looked like strands of hair woven into its length. Where the frost had kissed it, it gleamed too bright, too alive. Her stomach turned. She staggered backward, clutching her shawl tight, and didn't look again until she'd reached her porch. When she finally turned back, the boys were gone. But the strange cord still hung from the branch, swaying gently in a wind she couldn't feel. That night, Alma Bree dreamed of a cradle carved from bone, rocking slowly in an endless room with no walls. When she woke, her hair was wet with frost, and a small knot identical to the ones she'd seen had been tied around her wrist. By February, the preacher had begun locking the chapel doors at sundown, though he never said what he feared might find its way inside. Those who noticed said he no longer looked toward the ridge when speaking of grace or mercy. Instead, he kept his eyes down, staring at the deep, worn grooves of the pulpit, as if something was written there long ago. On the first Sunday of Lent, he called for the blessing of the town's children. The mothers held their babies tight, and the fathers clutched their hymnals with white-knuckled hands. As the hymn rose inside the chapel, the back door creaked open on its own, untouched by any hand. The twins stood there in the threshold, cheeks flushed, hair damp, as if they'd walked through a storm no one else had felt. No one dared move. The preacher lifted a trembling hand to welcome them, but they didn't step forward. Instead, their eyes turned upward, toward the empty space where the bell rope once hung. In perfect sync, they parted their lips, but nothing came out. And yet, every infant in the room burst into cries, high and sharp, and rising until the very rafters groaned. Mothers clutched their babies, rocking in panic. Fathers let their hymnals drop to the floor. Then, just as suddenly, the twins turned and stepped back into the snow, leaving behind a silence that pressed heavier than any noise. By morning, their footprints still remained outside the chapel deep, perfect and untouched by the thaw. Parents warned their children away, but a small boy named Cyrus Bell slipped out alone before dawn, too young to know fear. He came back before the sun had fully risen, barefoot and silent, holding something cupped tightly in both hands, lock of fine pale hair tied with red thread. His mother tried to take it, but he clutched it to his chest, unblinking. When she finally forced his fingers open, the hair was gone, melted into a strange white smear across his palm. That night, Cyrus began humming in his sleep, a strange, halting tune that never repeated. His father lit every lamp in the house, but still, the corners of the room deepened into shadow, as if something unseen was sitting just beyond the light, waiting. Before sunrise, the boys' humming finally stopped. When the doctor arrived, he found no fever, no injury, only a faint, almost invisible line wrapped around Cyrus's wrist, like he'd been tied with something thinner than thread. No one in the house slept again without a candle burning. Still, some claimed they heard the melody linger in the corners, soft and unfinished. March brought thunderstorms that rattled the creek beds, but the heaviness that hung over the parish didn't lift. Calves and lambs were born early, lifeless, their small bodies cold, no matter how quick the hands or how hot the water. The preacher, desperate, made his way back to the ridge. At the cabin, he found the door ajar, the hearth cold, and the twins seated at the table, unmoving, eyes wide and fixed on something just past the wall. Between them sat a bowl of still water, untouched. He stepped inside, announced himself in a hoarse voice that didn't sound like his own. The boys didn't move. In perfect unison, they each placed a hand gently onto the water's surface. The preacher, staggered in invisible pressure, gripped his chest, ribs tightening like they were being twisted inward by unseen hands. He turned to flee, words vanishing from his mouth before they could rise. But as he reached the door, he looked back once. Susanna stood in the frame now, face empty, her apron soaked and heavy with something that dripped slowly to the floor, one drop at a time. When he closed his eyes to pray, he didn't see God. He saw two small hands, pale and steady, pressing hard against his heart. By the time the spring equinox arrived, the land itself seemed to curdle. The old well behind the chapel, once known for its clear, sweet water, began drawing up something sour thick, with the scent of rust and something more ancient. A seamstress, fetching a pail at dusk, claimed she saw a pale, unfamiliar face reflected beneath the surface, its eyes wide, mouth half open, as if whispering a warning. She dropped her bucket and never returned. That same week, the last census taker willing to make the journey from Montgomery Road in unannounced, determined to log every living soul in the parish born, adopted, or otherwise. He made for the cabin first, though the surrounding fields were still buried in snow. The path to the door was bare. He knocked, and the door opened without a touch. The twins stood side by side, hands clasped, dressed alike in coarse linen. Behind them, an empty cradle rested on the table, holding nothing but a folded scrap of cloth. The man stepped forward, pen poised over his ledger, ready to speak. But before a word left his mouth, the page turned black in his hands, the ink spreading outward like frost. He dropped the book, stumbled back, breath caught in his throat. When he picked it up again, every line had been filled with the same name, repeated over and over in a hand he somehow recognized. Yours, yours. He never returned. When dusk fell and he failed to appear in town, a search party was formed, though no one truly wanted to cross that ridge. They found his horse tied neatly at the gate, steam curling from its nose in the fading light. Inside the cabin, the air hung thick and damp, as though the hearth had been doused, not with water, but with something heavier. The ledger was still open when they entered, its pages soaked in inked script, one word repeated endlessly in an eerie, looping hand. Return. There was no sign of the twins, nor of Susanna. The once empty cradle now held a tightly wrapped bundle of cloth, aged and colorless, like snow long fallen. One man, braver or perhaps more foolish, creached forward and lifted the linen. Inside, resting silently, was a small jawbone, no larger than a sparrow's beak, its teeth still smooth and perfect, like a child's first molars. He placed it back down, his skin crawling. The group left quickly after that. No one touched the ledger, no one disturbed the bundle again. By morning, both had vanished. Left behind in their place were the census takers, boots positioned heel to toe, as if he'd walked backward out of this world. At the door, a fine dusting of white powder outlined two tiny footprints pressed heel to heel on the wooden floorboards. As April approached, families began leaving under cover of darkness. Wagons creaking down the parish roads, curtains drawn, mouths closed tight. But some remained rooted by habit, by stubbornness, or by fear, too old to name. It was they who noticed first the trees budding too early, pale saplings climbing out of the soil like breath held too long. Each morning brought more, with leaves the color of wax and roots twisted in shapes no blade could loosen. One evening, as a widow tended her chicken coops, she glanced toward the orchard, and there they stood, the twins, watching. Their faces tilted toward the sky, as if tuned to something no one else could hear. In their hands, the boys held twine strung with tiny, bone-white fragments, each piece polished smooth and threaded like charms. The widow called out instinctively, her voice cracking through the still air. They didn't flinch. Instead, they slowly turned to meet her gaze, their eyes gleaming in the dying light, pupils vertical and sharp like a sliver of obsidian. Panic surged through her. She stumbled back inside, shoving a chair against the door, though she knew it wouldn't hold. All night she kept watch by the hearth, clutching her rosary. While the knocking began just before dawn, two sets of knuckles rapping together in eerie rhythm, slow and precise, as if keeping time for something waiting. When the sun finally rose, the noise ceased, but overhead, traced in thin, sticky sap across the wooden frame, was a single word, again by early May. The parish had become a ghost in conversation, its name skipped over in prayers and spoken only in whispers. But the ridge cabin didn't fade with the silence. Each morning, a ribbon of smoke drifted from the chimney, thin as hair, pale as bone. Those few who stayed claimed it stank faintly of curdled milk and something worse, brine or blood left too long in the air. One evening, a girl sent to retrieve a missing dog came back just after sunset, barefoot, her expression hollow, palms pressed flat over her stomach, like she held something too fragile to show. Her mother gently pulled her hands away and found a shadowy bruise, shaped like two small feet pointed together. The girl said nothing, didn't cry, only hummed softly in a slow and broken rhythm that raised gooseflesh down her mother's arms. That night, the hound returned alone, a dark line drawn perfectly down its snout, from crown to nose sharp and straight as if carved. No one in that house ever slept again without nailing the shutters shut. Still, folks whispered that the girl's quiet humming never stopped, slipped beneath the floorboards, curling through roots and stone, like the earth itself had begun to hum along. That summer came early and heavy, but its heat did nothing to lift the strange stillness that had settled across the land. Rows of corn twisted back toward the soil, as if ashamed of their reach. The creek, once lively, now trickled over stones, marked with symbols no one dared trace. On the longest day of June, the chapel bell rang for a newborn who never took a breath. That's what the midwife swore. But when they carried the mother's body from the bed, her eyes wide, her mouth frozen mid-plea, the bundle she'd been clutching was gone. The midwife vanished that same night. Her footprints, the last two, crossed the ridge in weeks. Come morning, the churchyard was littered with pieces of knotted twine, each tied to ash-colored rags. Some said they were swaddles left behind. Others whispered they were offerings. Either way, no one touched them. At sundown, the twins were seen again drifting between the rows of warped corn, twine slung over their shoulders like a craftsman's tool. Their faces were still serene, like they were simply walking through what already belonged to them. By midsummer, the air turned thick and heavy, as though it waited for someone to give it a name. One farmer, Lyle, who had sworn never to leave his father's land, woke early to scatter salt along the thresholds. But as he stepped out into the gray light, he saw each doorway already marked with a curling symbol he'd never seen before on the lintel above his door. He found a strange symbol, two circles intersecting a third, etched so delicately it looked sewn into the wood by a needle. He tried to wipe it away, but the harder he scrubbed, the deeper it seemed to sink, as though memory itself had carved it. That night, lying stiff beside his wife, he heard it soft at first, like fabric brushing the bottom of an empty cradle. Then came a rhythm, measured, deliberate tapping beneath the floorboards in time with his own heartbeat, until he couldn't tell whether it was inside him or beneath the house. When the sound ceased, he crept to the window. Across the yard stood the twins, hand in hand, staring up at him with quiet faces. Their mouths moved, but no sound came. Still, he knew they weren't speaking, they were counting. By July, the counting had spread. Children across the ridge began waking in the dark, upright in bed, lips moving in slow, silent sequences of numbers no one could name. When their parents shook them, they stilled, wide-eyed and silent, listening for something beyond hearing. Mothers wept in secret. Fathers nailed shut every door, placed open Bibles on thresholds. But still, the twins came, never knocking, never speaking, never crossing the threshold, just standing, side by side, at chapel steps, in schoolyards tangled with weeds, beneath window eaves where newborns cried through the night. They came barefoot, and wherever they stood, the earth gave way beneath their feet, softening, as though eager to welcome them home. When morning light crept over the ridge, the twins were gone again, leaving only faint reminders in their wake. Damp footprint on a wooden porch step, a loop of twine hooked gently over a cradle rail, a single gray feather pressed beneath the kitchen door like a hush left behind. Each time they vanished, the counting grew, a whisper becoming a chant, rising from the breath of children across the parish until it sounded like the land itself had learned to tally something ancient and unnamed. That August, the preacher's baby girl, Laura, slipped into a sleep that no lullaby or prayer could break. Her body stayed warm, but her breaths were slow and stretched so far apart her mother wept between them, afraid each one was the last. Desperate, the preacher carried her up the ridge to where the crooked cabin watched in silence. He placed Laura gently on the threshold, his voice cracking as he begged whatever force dwelled there to show mercy. The door opened without touch. Inside, no fire burned. A figure emerged from the dark, thin, bent, with long gray hair spilling loose over her shoulders. Susanna moved past the preacher like he was made of fog, her eyes hollow with years no one had counted. She gathered Laura into her arms, and as she did, the twins appeared behind her, their hands resting lightly on the baby's chest. The preacher dropped to his knees, the stillness around him so thick it rang in his skull like iron on stone. He never recalled descending the ridge, only that when he came to on his own porch, Laura was resting against him, wide awake, her eyes open and unreadable. After Laura came back, eyes open but never blinking again, the parish seemed to tighten its grip on silence. The dogs didn't bark, the wind didn't stir, the corn, now brittle and bowed like old men in pews. Even the creek held still, its surface a glassy hush that dared no ripple. Inside, families sat behind bolted doors, staring into dark corners, waiting for the counting they'd come to know like breath. But that night, no numbers came, only a thick, pressing stillness that slipped through window cracks and curled around beams, shrinking rooms and stretching the quiet until it felt like the walls might fold in. Then, just before dawn, the knocking began to measured taps at every single door along the ridge. Always the same knock. Pause. Knock. No one replied, no one moved. Yet when the sun rose, every doorframe bore the same word, not carved, but somehow grown into the wood itself, like the grain had always meant to say it, yours. The preacher, gaunt and pale, walked barefoot from house to house, touching each mark with trembling fingers, saying nothing. When he reached the cabin on the ridge, he didn't knock. He pressed his palm against the worn boards, closed his eyes, and began to count. Somewhere beyond the sycamores, two voices joined him, soft, steady, never rushed. And when August came, the land itself began to change. The road bent into shallow trenches that refused to smooth, no matter how many rains washed through. Tree roots cracked the earth like old wounds reopening, leaking sap that smelled like curdled milk and something older, something that had waited a long time to be remembered. The children claimed by the counting no longer stirred between the numbers. Their breath, if it existed, grew so shallow even their mothers couldn't swear they still drew it. Those who stayed beside them said their chests rose, not like sleepers, but like the slow pull of tides beneath some distant moon. One morning, the widow Bryce walked the ridge alone, driven by something unspoken. She found the twins on the stoop, fingers laced, heads bowed like they were praying. Between them sat a cradle she swore hadn't been there days before. When she leaned in to look, what waited inside sent her running down the hill, skirts bunched in her fists, her cry ripping through the morning like a door slammed too late. When her neighbors begged her to say what she'd seen, she whispered, "It was mine, it was waiting for me, and nothing more." As the summer dimmed, the town stopped hoping for mercy. The counting faded, replaced by a tune no one could recall after, waking only the sense that it had been sung low and close by voices not their own. On the final Sunday before harvest, what was left of the congregation climbed the ridge behind their preacher. He didn't speak. No songs were sung. They came barefoot, empty-handed, their expressions hollowed of fear or faith. At the door, the twins waited, their gaze frosted and distant, like the air just before the season turns. And one by one, the townsfolk reached out and pressed their palms against the wood. Not in worship, not in plea only, in recognition of something that had never asked, yet always been owed. Inside, no light flickered and no fire smoldered, yet those who'd pressed their palms to the door swore they heard something, a slow, wet breath, like wind drawn through cloth soaked in grief. When the last hand dropped away, the preacher turned toward the valley, his voice brittle as old bark. "This is where it ends," he said. No reply came, yet every head bowed, a silent amen. That night, not a cry stirred the air, but in each abandoned cradle, the linens grew warm with a heat no fire had given. By September, the parish was no longer a place so much as a memory too stubborn to fade. The roads choked with vines, roots thick as wrists, pulling wagons sideways until their wheels snapped. Strangers who stumbled in by chance never stayed. They told of trees bending against the wind, limbs crossing behind them as if the forest meant to seal its own past. of those left behind too old to run, too stitched to the land to imagine escape. A stillness settled, not fear, acceptance. A hush so deep it felt sewn into the walls. Windows stayed shut, no matter the weather. Wells were boarded up with latticework, nailed tight, as though something might try to reach a crawl free. The chapel, long, roofless, opened to the sky like a wound. No one dared step inside, but on certain nights, just where the ridge begins to rise, some claimed to hear the scrape of pews across stone, shifting, rearranging, as if the church still gathered a congregation that had never truly left. The twins no longer wandered down to the road, nor did their faces appear behind the frost-laced glass. Instead, they seemed absorbed by the cabin itself, fused into its bones, glimpsed only in the splintered gaps between warped boards, like the house was breathing them in. One morning, a woman passing with an empty basket looked up and caught their pale faces watching her, heads tilted like they were listening to something whispering through the rafters. Her hands loosened without her knowing, basket thudding to earth. When she reached for it, her cabbages had ruptured, each one leaking a soft, pinkish pulp she couldn't bring herself to touch. She walked away without looking back. Days later, every cabbage in her field bloomed with the same quiet decay, split open as if by a gentle, unseen pressure. After that, no more babies cried into the frost, and the cornfields stood abandoned, brittle and watchful. But the parish was not empty. At dusk, curtains shifted without wind. Footsteps creaked across thresholds, long untouched. The sounds always came from the ridge. Some said it was memory grief, echoing too loudly in hollow places. But others whispered that it wasn't in their heads. It was the land itself rocking, like the whole hill had become the lap of something ancient and waiting. Older than sorrow, older than the names of the gods they'd stopped calling. Those who held on to belief stopped closing their curtains at night. They simply sat motionless in the dark, hands clasped, waiting quietly to be counted. The final frost came too soon, coating every field in a glaze so sharp and glassy it seemed the earth itself had been sealed under a thin layer of breath. The crows no longer circled the broken chapel spire. Even the bugs had gone, leaving a silence so perfect the living began to wonder if they'd been left behind. From the ridge, no smoke rose from the chimney, just the faint curl of breath. Now and then, slipping through the splintered wood like fog, slow and steady, as if exhaled by something that had never learned to breathe. One morning, Ruth Anson, a widow who'd outlived even her memories, climbed the hill with her apron filled with salt. Her hair was tied with a ribbon her mother once wore, and a weathered Bible was tucked under one arm. No one called after her. The townsfolk just stood by the roadside, holding on to each other like fence posts in a storm. They knew she wouldn't come back, the same if she came back at all. Ruth didn't knock. She poured the salt in a crooked ring around the doorframe, her fingers trembling so hard the line broke in places. Then she placed her hand on the wood, breath fogging in the cold, and whispered the names of the 3 children she'd carried but never heard cry. Each name like a thread unraveling into the quiet dot. As Ruth whispered those lost names, the wood beneath her hand grew warm, then warmer still, till she felt a quiet thudding beneath her palm, a heartbeat not her own. The door opened without a sound, smooth and slow, like it had been waiting. Inside, no candle burned, yet everything glowed in a pale, cold clarity. The twins sat at the table, hands folded neatly around a piece of twine that trailed into a cradle she swore hadn't been there before. It rocked by itself, its surface carved with shapes her mind instantly rejected. No child rested there, only a bundle wrapped in fabric the color of morning fog. Ruth couldn't move forward. Her legs held her still, but she knew deep in the marrow of her bones that this wasn't a gift. It was a memory made solid. The cradle stopped. The twins looked up, and their eyes blank as winter sky just before the first hail met hers. Ruth tried to speak, but only silent tears came, freezing against her cheeks as she turned away, leaving behind her salt, her Bible, and the last ribbon her mother had tied in her hair. She never looked back. When the townsfolk met her at the bottom of the ridge, her face bore the weight of something she'd been given and could never let go. That night, she sat upright until sunrise, both hands folded gently over her belly, humming a lullaby no one remembered learning, but somehow everyone knew. And as the ridge slipped fully into winter, the land gave way. The rows of corn bent inward, collapsing like ribs pulled tight around something too old to name. The paths that once split through the valley with the certainty of Scripture now curled like smoke, always leading wanderers back to where they began. No matter how far they walked or how many turns they took, the ending was always the same. The rhythm of time had unraveled, no longer counted in sunrises and shadows, but in a slow loop, as if wound too tightly around the ridge. Children, still curious, began to ask the questions no one wanted to answer. What happens when you count past forever? Where do names go when no lips speak them? Why does the cradle sway if no hands are left to calm it? Beneath each question was a silence too aware, as though something old was listening not to learn, but to remember. One night, as the first snow sighed from the sky, the preacher returned to the ridge, alone. No flock followed, only a strip of linen in his fist, twisted into the shape of an endless loop. Some believed he came to seal the door, to treat the house like a wound that might scab over if left untouched. Others said he came to plead, though no one agreed whether he sought mercy or meaning. He stood in the snow, breath short and jagged, knuckles glowing pale around the cloth. Just as his hand lifted to knock, the door opened on its own, and in that instant, even the snow held still in the air, frozen mid-descent like the world itself was holding its breath. Inside, the twins sat waiting. They didn't rise. They didn't speak. They had been expecting him. They didn't call to him. But when their eyes found his, it was like staring into the weight of every name never spoken again, every cradle that had stood waiting for a voice that never came. He stepped forward, one foot and then the other, until he stood just before the threshold. There, his courage stalled. The twins raised their palms, open and still, and he followed their gaze down. The cloth he had carried, knotted tight in purpose, had unspooled, no loop left, just a trembling line across the sill. He fell to his knees, salt tears cutting clean through the dust on his skin, and bowed his head low in that perfect silence. The cradle inside rocked twice, then it stopped. But the next morning, his boots were found standing together on the chapel's steps, filled with snow, smoothed over like untouched sugar. November arrived like a blade, cold enough to shatter barrels before the sky had even turned blue. Frost coated the windows with icy ferns, so thick they cracked the panes like spider webs spun by memory. No one cleared them. By then, the parish had come to believe that seeing could wound worse than anything unseen. And still, just before the sun could risen, another sound began to move across the fields, slow and steady, like something rocking. In a dark attic, some said it came from everywhere. Others said it came only from the ridge. But no one climbed to know for sure, not until dusk. And had never known a time before the counting when lullabies held promise instead of sorrow, and cradles were simply furniture, not graves. To him, the ridge was not haunted, was waiting. That evening, as his mother slept beside the last flicker of dying coals, he slipped out barefoot, leaving no word, only the hush of parting. The cold bit his skin, but he didn't flinch. Passing the charred circle where the chapel's pews once burned into the earth, past the last lantern, flickering like memory, too stubborn to fade. At the cabin, the door opened on its own. No creak, no call. Inside, the twins sat silent, beside a cradle the size of a breadbasket, its wood etched in shapes that slid sideways if stared at too long. What lay within wasn't child or shadow, but something breathing, slowly, as if remembering life more than living it. Jonas stepped closer, the hush tightening around him like a held breath. He didn't speak. He only reached into his pocket and placed a broken string of rosary beads, snapped when his brother was lowered into cold earth, gently onto the blanket. The twins placed their hands over it like a blessing lost to time, and Jonas turned and walked away, the silence letting him go like a door closing on the last page of a story never written. He stepped into the snow without a sound, each footprint vanishing behind him like ripples sealing shut. By sunrise, the cradle was gone, the cabin closed tight once more. But across Dogwood Hollow, every doorstep bore a single loop of twine, knotted as if sealing a vow that no prayer could undo. The snow thickened overnight, cloaking the land in a silence so deep even the boldest kept behind their doors. But the counting returned just before dawn, gentle, almost tender, like a lullaby breathed over wood. One voice began, high and thin, echoing where names had once been whispered, in hope. No one could tell if the voices rose upward or simply circled the same ancient spiral, but the sound pulled something, hollow and aching in every chest. Just before the light broke, two women met in the road, not by plan, but by something older than instinct. They had once known the weight of infants who never cried, breasts gone heavy with milk that soured in grief. Saying nothing, they walked toward the ridge, their skirts frosting stiff as they climbed. And as they neared the crooked cabin, the sharp like salt left too long in a wound, and beneath it all, the dark within deeper than night itself, though dusk still faintly glowed behind them. Swaying gently without a hand, the older woman stepped in first, her scarf frayed with years, and leaned to peer inside. What she saw struck her silent. A bundle wrapped in linen the color of a fading sky, small enough to fit her palm, yet too heavy with meaning to lift. Behind her, the second woman dropped to her knees without a word, tears freezing on her cheeks. Neither begged, neither prayed. That was not their place. They were only meant to witness. As the cradle came to rest, the twins raised their hands, palms facing out, in a gesture that felt more ancient than comfort or curse. Wordless, the women turned and walked back into the snow. Their expressions, unreadable grief, awe, reverence, all folded into one. By morning, the snow had erased their tracks, but on each of their palms, a thin, pale line had appeared, as though something unseen had traced its greeting there before letting them go. December settled over Dogwood Hollow like a hand gently laid across a sleeping face, into something quieter, less peace than surrender, but close enough for the exhausted to confuse the two. Snow blanketed the village in even layers, untouched by wind or thaw, smooth as skin pulled tight over bones. Some whispered that the ridge itself breathed beneath it, rising and falling in time with the song the twins never stopped humming. Others believed the land had simply grown tired, praying, of hoping, of waiting for a salvation that never came. Faith, if it lingered, was a secret thing, held like a matchstick in a cold hand. On the 7th night of Advent, Elijah Price, not even the iron cross that had hung at his neck since the day his mother died, his footprints vanished behind him as he climbed, and no one called out. By now, they knew some paths could only be walked alone. When Elijah reached the cabin, he entered without knocking, and the silence that met him didn't resist it, welcomed him, folding over his shoulders like the weight of something he'd been carrying all his life without knowing. The twins sat motionless, their fingertips barely touching the cradle. Whatever lay wrapped inside had grown. He didn't know how he could tell, only that the air around it felt heavier, pulling every bit of warmth and sound toward its stillness. Elijah moved quietly across the creaking floorboards and knelt beside it, the silence pressing close around him. The twins didn't speak, didn't blink. They only raised their hands, palms up, like they were offering something invisible, sacred. In that hush, something stirred inside him, a song, broken and half forgotten, a lullaby his mother used to hum when her fever was rising and the days blurred together. He hadn't thought of it in years, yet now, with the scent of snow and wood smoke clinging to his coat, the words slipped from his mouth like breath. He sang without meaning to, and as the melody floated through the room, the linen in the cradle lifted ever so slightly, as though echoing the tune. A wave of heat spread into his hands, not burning, but aching in a way that made tears rise without warning. When the song faded, he laid his hand gently on the bundle. No movement met his touch, no breath stirred. Only the quiet exhale of the twins, soft and steady, like wind through hollow wood. Rising slowly, Elijah felt something leave him, not a weight, exactly, but the absence of it. He turned toward the door, stepped out into the deep snow, and, though it stung against his skin, he didn't flinch. Behind him, the door shut without a sound, as if the cabin, too, was finally at rest. At sunrise, the town stirred to find the chapel bell back in place, its heavy form hanging silent above the ruin, no rope in sight, no hands left to summon its voice. The turning of the year brought storms sooner than anyone could recall, and Dogwood Hollow quietly slipped off maps and out of memory. Those who still mentioned it did so with puzzled expressions, recalling overgrown roads and a sagging church that didn't match the stories whispered downstate. From afar, the ridge was plain, just a line of frostbitten trees and stubborn brush. The cabin, tilted and gray, looked like it had been forgotten by time itself, but the ones who had lived there knew better. They knew time had bent around that ridge, woven itself into every beam of the house and every empty cradle it had held. The land hadn't forgotten. It remembered in silence, shaping the thawing fields into ribbed patterns, like something buried just beneath the surface. Pools gathered in shallow dips, but mirrored no sky, as if the heavens had turned away. The cabin door creaked open and closed in the wind, again and again, like someone pacing trapped between going and staying. And up in the broken chapel tower, the bell hung still, yet each dawn it rang once. No clapper, no wind, just one low, hollow sound that sank into bones. And settled there, beneath that single toll, another softer note curled through the airfint, steady, like a thread pulled tight through the seams of what was left behind. The creak of a cradle echoed through the frozen soil, slow and steady, as if the ground itself had taken up a lullaby no mother remained to sing. Then, late one February afternoon, a stranger appeared, stepping in from the long-abandoned northern road. He was young, maybe 30, face carved thin by hunger or solitude, eyes fixed on the ridge like something there had whispered his name. No faces watched him arrive, no curtains stirred, but the snow behind him kept every step preserved like pressed wax. He carried only a worn canvas sack and a length of cord twisted twice around his wrist in a pattern the locals once feared. At the first empty cabin, he paused, breathing in the cold, as if it carried voices, then moved on, boots leaving shallow indentations that the wind didn't dare erase. When he reached the broken chapel, he entered, without hesitation, stepping between pews left to rot beneath open sky. At the altar, he pressed his palm flat to the wood. The air shifted. Even the breeze grew still. Not a prayer left his lips, but his bowed head bore the weight of someone answering a call older than language. Beneath his touch, the altar stirred faint and rhythmic, like it remembered the pulse of the people who had once gathered here, hoping for grace they would never quite receive. As he lifted his head, tears streaked down his face, unacknowledged, as if they belonged to someone else. Without a backward glance, he made his way toward the ridge, his footprints disappearing in the snow almost as fast as he made them. The cabin door stood wide open, the dark within not just an absence of light, but a presence of something deeper. At the threshold, the cord wrapped around his wrist caught a faint shimmer, pulsing like blood beneath skin. He stepped through, and the silence inside thickened. The twins waited, still and solemn, hands resting quietly as they faced the cradle. Its shape had changed taller now, its pale wood-marked, with intricate patterns that looked like threads spun from air. Inside, the linen was no longer gray, but a soft, clean white. As he moved closer, the twins looked up, and something unseen, but vast, settled in the space between them, as if it had always been watching, waiting. He dropped to his knees, the cord on his wrist glowing faintly as he exhaled a single breath that left his chest hollow and wide. From the sack, he pulled a bundle wrapped in faded cloth, no larger than a folded handkerchief, and placed it carefully. On the cradle's edge, the twins touched it, their fingers so gentle the air bent around them. The cradle moved once, then again inside. The swaddled shape shifted slightly. Not the movement of life as it's known, but something else. Something in between. Something no one had the right to name. He stayed there for what felt like the length of a forgotten season, his head bowed, one hand resting gently on the edge of the cradle. No sound came from him, no whispered hope or sorrow, only the steady pulse of a silence that knew his name. It was the same quiet rhythm that had haunted every empty crib in Dogwood Hollow since the first breath never came. When he finally stood, the cord around his wrist had come undone, its ends curling against his hand like something released. The twins didn't speak, didn't move, but their eyes held the weight of a knowing that stretched back to the very beginning. He turned without farewell, stepping into the stillness outside as dusk thickened around him. Snow started to fall. Again, light as ash, drifting from a long-dead fire, but it left no trace on his coat, no sign in the path he left behind. By the time he reached the trees, the cabin had gone dark. Only the cradle remained, its pale curve glowing faintly in the shadows like a memory refusing to be forgotten. And when the chapel bell rang again the next morning, its hollow note drifted across a valley where no one remained to hear it. The day broke in a light too thin to warm the frost. The ridge lay quiet beneath a smooth white veil, the kind of stillness that suggested time had stopped to catch its breath. No prince crossed the road, no smoke lifted from chimney tops. The chapel stood mute, its bell rimmed in ice, swaying gently in a breeze that carried no sound in that hush. The hollow seemed to breathe with a rhythm not meant for human lungs, a long, ancient exhale that softened every line and edge, as though the land itself had grown weary of pretending to be real. To any travel-if such a soul still wandered, the forgotten back roads it would have looked as if the town had simply exhaled and folded itself into slumber. But beneath the heavy eaves of the sagging house at the ridge's crown, the twins still watched, and the cradle still moved with no wind to guide it. On the second morning of the thaw, a figure appeared. No tracks led to her, no path marked her arrival. She stood as though summoned, wrapped in a shawl the color of bruised sky, her hair tucked beneath a kerchief stained faintly with salt, like the ghost of tears dried long ago. Some whispered she'd once been a midwife in a coastal town swallowed by fever. Others believed she wasn't living at all, just another echo of the hush itself, shaped into form. She carried no lantern, though the morning was dim, only a bundle, bound so tight against her that its shape defied naming, part child, part memory, entirely neither. Without hesitation, she reached the cabin's door, which opened not from force but familiarity, as if it had always known her scent. Inside, the twins turned in perfect symmetry, their eyes reflecting a light that came from nowhere, soft, milky glow, like a lullaby without sound. The cradle between them remained untouched, its linen folds as pale and patient as the air. The woman stepped forward without a word, melting snow trailing behind her, and stood in silence. Her breath, the only thing moving, slow and deliberative. If she had never been rushed by anything living, when she finally spoke, her voice was low and rough, thinned by the weight of too many names she had once whispered and never forgotten. "It's time," she said, barely more than breath. The twins offered no reply, only watched as she slowly knelt and unwrapped the bundle she had carried across miles of silence. What lay inside wasn't a child, not exactly a coil of pale cloth and finer hair, shaped like something once meant to hold breath, now hollowed by time. She lifted it with both hands, and at that moment the cradle's linen rose faintly at its center, not alive, not quite, but something close. With trembling hands, she placed the offering down, her fingers shaking not from fear, but from the ache of knowing. The twins rested their palms over it with the quiet care of those returning something long missing. The hush swelled, deep and pulsing, until the very timbers of the house seemed to breathe in and out. She bowed her head, and behind closed eyes, she saw every child she had ever brought into the world, their first gasps, their final silences, each one stitched to the next by an invisible thread. When she opened her eyes again, the bundle was gone. Only the linen remained, smooth and empty, untouched by the shape it had held. Her breath snagged for a heartbeat, caught between the impulse to cry and the emptiness left by years of tears, spent on floors just like this beneath beams that never asked what sorrow they held. When she looked at the twins, they no longer seemed like children but record keepers, silent guardians of truths never written. "Thank you," she murmured, the words thinner than she wanted, but all she had left. Rising slowly, her joints whispered with the echo of every bed she had ever knelt beside. As she stepped into the pale morning, the snow parted quietly, as if recognizing the shape of grief she'd carried too long. Behind her, the door closed on its own, the hush following like breath exhaled into her spine. It stayed with her, not haunting, not cruel, but woven into her being. At her back, the cradle gave one final rock, a motion as ancient as any blessing ever spoken. When she reached the chapel's remains, snow began to fall again, soft as dust from wings. She looked upward, watching the flakes dissolve into the hollow sky where the bell had once lived, and something inside her unclenched. Her hand rested gently on her chest. The pulse beneath was steady, unchanged, but she knew now part of her would always remain in that cradle. A whisper of her name dissolved into the hush she could never lift. No one witnessed her leave. No one ever followed. In the months that came, the road to Dogwood Hollow vanished beneath snow that never gave way. The cabin settled slowly into the softened earth, while brambles thickened over the ridge like flesh healing over a wound untouched. Still, in the years that followed, a few said that if you stood near where the old posts still leaned, you might hear the faint groan of wood, and through the tangle glimpse a cradle rocking patient, ceaseless, as though awaiting a hand that would never return. When winter loosened its grip at last, and spring crept into the hollows, Dogwood Hollow left no trace behind, nothing but a fold in the land. Trees claimed the old roads, vines wove across door frames like green stitches binding shut forgotten stories. The chapel fell in on itself without storm or sound, the bell vanishing beneath beams no one would ever lift again. Yet beneath the overgrowth and soft decay, the hush endured a breath that remembered every heartbeat that had ever trembled there. And when the thaw reached the ridge, it found no mark of life, no trail to follow. Only the cabin remained, bowed and silent, as if even the house had grown tired of remembering alone. The door stood slightly open, and behind it the stillness pulsed like a slow, endless breath, as if the cabin itself had been wrapped in something unseen. None crossed the threshold. Even the boldest turned away after a glimpse, their eyes wet with a sorrow they couldn't name. Just before looking back, each swore they saw the cradle still swaying, as though time had agreed to hold its breath. On a night with no frost and no moon to touch the fields, a small boy wandered into the clearing, No one knew his name, and no one ever searched for him. He wore a coat too big for his frame, and held a single knitted slipper, his eyes wide and empty, like he hadn't slept in days. When he reached the door, he stepped in without pause. The darkness met him gently, like arms meant to comfort rather than warn. Inside, the twins raised their heads, their hands already resting on the cradle, and looked at him with neither surprise nor sorrow. He moved toward them, quiet as breath, the floor beneath his feet silent and still. When the boy reached the cradle, he placed the slipper down gently, like setting an offering on sacred ground. He hadn't remembered why he carried it until that very moment. Around him, the hush rose and fell, a rhythm that slowly intertwined with the faint pattern of his breath. For a long time, no one moved. Then he reached out, his small hand resting on the cradle's curve. The cloth inside stirred something beneath it, shifting, as if listening. He didn't flinch or pull away. He simply closed his eyes. No voice greeted him, no names echoed through the air. Yet, in that silence, something was shared between the child and the watchers, an understanding older than words or fear. The twins lowered their hands and folded them neatly in their laps. The cradle stilled. A soft breath passed through the rafters, and for the first time in that long, haunted house, the silence felt whole, fulfilled. By morning, nothing had changed. The door remained open. The cradle stood untouched, except for the single slipper resting atop its linen. It was the only sign that a child had ever come. Those who passed near the ridge in the months that followed said the hush had softened, like a final sum had been settled, and the last line written. The fields no longer whispered numbers, no phantom hands knocked, only the wind remained, carrying the faintest lullaby, one without words, heard only by those who had once rocked a child to sleep. Years drifted by, and the ridge softened beneath blankets of green, no longer burdened by memory or the weight of names. The cabins sagged where they stood, and moss swallowed the last traces of the chapel's frame. Still, on moonless nights, when the air turned warm and heavy, those who wandered too close felt a quiet pressure inside their chest, as if the earth itself remembered every birth as a binding promise, one it might one day collect. In that moment, they understood what the old parish had learned far too late, that not every cradle is meant to be filled, and some names, once spoken into the hush, can never be taken back. So the ridge kept its long watch, gentle and endless, like a lullaby. No voice needed to carry. The cabin leaned, the cradle rocked, the hush lingered, steady as breath, long after every tongue had stilled. Some who claimed to glimpse it near the end spoke of a lone figure standing quietly in the doorway. A child, perhaps, head bowed, hand resting on the cradle's edge, like it had always been his place. Whether it was the boy or some other child, never named, no one could say. But in that last silence, there was no fear. Only the stillness of something that had finally come full circle. If you've followed the story this far, then you already know some places do not vanish. They simply fold themselves into quiet, waiting for the world to forget how to look. Dogwood Hollow was never taken by snow or rot or time. It simply let itself go unseen. It unraveled slowly, until nothing was left but a silence too deep to carry, a hush that stayed behind. The cradle never stopped its gentle sway. The twins never blinked, their gaze locked on what could never be fully seen. The ledger stayed open-filled, with names barely whispered, and others too heavy to speak. Maybe you tell yourself it was sorrow that broke the parish, that no house could cradle silence so steady it learned to echo 1,000 heartbeats. But the ridge never asked for belief. It only asked that something be left behind, a breath, a forgotten promise, a memory too faint to name but too loud to silence. And when the last cradle is lowered into shadow, it will still be there, rocking quietly, waiting. So if you ever find yourself where roads fade into nothing, and the wind smells of brine and milk, listen. You might hear a counting, low and patient lullaby without words, heavy with the lives that came before. And if you feel that pressure on your chest, not cruel, just familiar, like hands that once held you when you couldn't hold yourself, don't run. Don't speak the names others told you not to, just stand still. Let the hush remember you. We're here, and whatever you do, never name what was never meant to be named.